Welcome to Neighbors in the Network, a new podcast from SPN. I'm James Pinello, your host. Today we're chatting with Brooke Medina. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I am delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Brooke is the Vice President of Communications at the John Locke Foundation, and she is just, in my estimation, a superwoman because of all the amazing things that not just John Locke puts out, but that she's authoring books and writing articles and doing podcast spots like this. So I don't know how you do it, but maybe you will find out a little bit better the secrets of your success through this interview. What do you think, Brooke?
I might be willing to divulge a few of them. I'm looking at my Starbucks coffee right now with an extra shot of espresso, and that might be part of the secret sauce.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Maybe we'll get more tips later on. So tell me a little bit more about your background. Like, where did you grow up and how did it shape you?
Yeah. Whew. So I was a military kid, grew up all over the place. The world is the military child's oyster in many ways. So I was born in Oklahoma, but then moved to Guatemala, then Arkansas, then Germany, North Carolina, and have lived in a number of other states across the country. And that certainly shaped me because as a military kid, you learn adaptability and the importance of just kind of rolling with things that are well beyond your control. And also finding some wonder and satisfying some curiosity about the world outside. And that is part of the joy of growing up as a military kid. But it was also sobering in a lot of ways growing up that way. Of course, oftentimes we think about the military and our minds will go to 9/11 related events and the war on terror. And so growing up as a child that lived on Fort Bragg and here in North Carolina, and my father gone a lot, that taught me a lot about the importance of serving others and living your life in a way that has an outsized impact beyond what you can just serve yourself and deliver to yourself, but working on behalf of the benefit of others. And so that really, really shaped me. Not only my father's service, but my parents were missionaries for a while as well.
Wow.
And so we went to foreign countries regularly. I can remember there wasn't a family trip we would ever take that we didn't spend some time doing a little bit of like going to an orphanage or maybe going to a hospital if they would let us, and praying for the people there. So a lot of that really shaped the way I look at public policy and look at those who are in my community, my neighbors. And so that all had a major formative work on my life.
I wonder though, so growing up and you're seeing service and that's ingrained in your roots. And I noticed that you had a BA in government from Regent University. Is that something that did you see politics like from a very early age then?
In some ways, I mean, my parents weren't overly political. They were very, very service oriented though. And being though a military family, government was always at the fore of my mind because they were the ones that called the shots on where we lived and what wars we got involved in and what would happen with my family. And so that was an element of my childhood that the government side of it, seeing how big the government was and how involved the federal government could be in my life as a kid. It gave me an interest in it. And also, though, I just saw the effects that it had on the everyday person who maybe wasn't even involved in the military, but was suffering from the effects of bad government policy. I look at public policy as the way I love my neighbor politically. And I have spent enough time working in the nonprofit space, particularly among those who are battling poverty. That was something I did as my first job, is working with folks who had food insecurity, couldn't pay their utility bills, and they all had such unique stories. It wasn't always the same thing that led them into that position, but oftentimes they were looking for solutions from government actors in many ways, or these nonprofits. And I just think about the way in which civil society is supposed to operate, and that they are supposed to fill that center space where these people are suffering. And yet so often people are inclined to seek the government solutions because of government's huge involvement in these areas, and the policies they've created have often created this vicious cycle that have led to these people struggling in the ways that they have. So that is a very long response, and I know I kind of meandered my way to your question about government, studying government, but that was really the motivator behind studying government, was just understanding that policy is how I love my neighbor politically.
Yeah, I got the sense even before you and I are having this conversation, I was watching Locke's excellent Policy and Pizza series, which I loved, and I saw the episode where you were a guest on there, and what really came through was a desire for, I forget exactly how you put it, but you said it was capitalism always has bad PR, where it seems like, or we confuse capitalism for cronyism, was what you had said. And what I got a sense for is what we're trying to do right now is give a face of a very caring, compassionate face to the liberty movement, to capitalism, to free markets and things like that, instead of kind of a very cold, like, well, life's tough sort of thing. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I understand the motivation behind the pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You've got this, and this hyper individualistic approach to things. I mean, I am a liberty lover, and I believe each individual should have the right to commandeer their own destiny. But there are so many people, life is messy, and there are a lot of people that get left behind, and we don't know their background or the circumstances that have seemed to sap away their agency. And so I think that when people oftentimes hear about capitalists and capitalism and free markets, they think only about the people at the top, the wealthiest, and don't see that as something with their name on it. And it is, but we have to be able to better communicate that it is, and remind people or help people discover for the first time the agency that they actually do have in this pursuit of the American dream.
That's beautiful. Well, help me make the gap here. So you started off working in that center that was helping people that were in poverty, but what was the moment where you're now, or maybe there was no moment, but how is it that you come to be working in the liberty movement now?
That's a long story. And a lot of it was actually spent by me not working outside of the home. So I started a family young. And after I worked in that nonprofit area, I decided I wanted to stay home with my kids. I just figured they were my first responsibility and my greatest joy and responsibility. And so I spent many years at home with them, continued my education during that time, homeschooled them. And then finally, once we moved to North Carolina, decided that it was time for me to go back to work. They were starting to get to be school aged, or a little bit older school age. My youngest finally was entering kindergarten. And my parents lived nearby, so I decided to get a job at Civitas Institute was what it was called. It was a smaller think tank here in the Raleigh area. And then we merged with the John Locke Foundation 2 years ago. And so that was really my first foray into think tanking, was working at Civitas Institute. I started as an intern. I was probably the oldest intern there. And that was humbling because I just didn't have any work experience in the think tank space. And so I started knowing virtually nothing about how a think tank operated. But I did know I've got a lot of this philosophical knowledge under my belt. I certainly know how to articulate some of these meta ideas. But then I got to look behind the curtain as to how research is conducted and how lawmakers and other stakeholders are persuaded. And I started that as an intern, and then was blessed with, people that trusted me and were giving me greater responsibility. And so now I am pleased and just humbled to be able to work with the communications team here and the other senior staff members.
That's wonderful. I'm glad that your path has led you to a place that's very fulfilling right now. I have a question, and it's a little personal, but I'm going to dare to ask it. So like my wife, we have three under three at our home, and my wife also decided to, step away from working outside the home to just work full time inside the home. And I know I have coworkers that I've spoken to here at SPN that also took kind of breaks from working outside the home. I really like the way you put that. Um, what's it like coming back, like after, being full time working in the home to now working at a think tank?
Yeah. It certainly was like I had a little bit of whiplash and didn't
Yeah.
really know exactly, okay, this is just so different than my typical schedule of taking kids to museums and practices and doing their math lessons with them. But it was exciting as well. I didn't ever feel like I couldn't do it or that I wasn't up to the task. It was still a little scary, and I had to sort of orient my own heart to the fact that this is a different season in our family's life. And I think being honest about what that season and the previous season looked like was really, really important. But also, to me, a lot of it had to do with, a mindset of this is where I'm supposed to be right now, and just a sort of knowing inside of me that this was the right decision to make at this time. One thing that drives me, and I imagine everybody listening is going to feel the same thing. It's just a human tendency, is just having the finish line of our lives at the forefront of our minds and remembering like, what matters most. And during that season that I stayed at home with my kids, it was a sacrifice because I knew I was not making career advances the way that other people my age were. Uh, but I always wanted to remember and reminded myself at the end of my days, I want to be very, very happy with the choices I've made. And I'm also very, very happy making this choice to transition back into the think tank space, or transition into it for the first time, but go back to work. And yeah, and just figuring out a good rhythm for our family. I think that's important. If someone has kids at home, it's important to just make sure that our priorities are ordered. And sometimes that will look different depending on the season of life you're in.
That makes sense. Thank you for sharing that. I think it'll be very helpful. So thank you. It's helpful to me. We'll watch this podcast, my wife and I together, and we'll compare notes about what we.
Hi, James' wife.
So tell me, can you share a story of a specific impact that your organization or you have had that maybe you're particularly proud of?
Oh, okay, yeah. So we've gotten to do a lot of good work that I'm really proud of. I would say one of the biggest ones for me was it wasn't just a campaign, but it was helping North Carolinians get certain issues back on the ballot, constitutional amendments. And so there were a couple of them, like a taxpayer's Bill of Rights type of amendment,
Hmm.
and then a voter ID one. Um, so they would center around and that was a pivotal year. That was in 2018, and it centered around just giving voters the right to be able to have more of a say in what was going on policy wise at the state level, particularly how it happened or what was in the Constitution. So it wasn't just like the Taxpayers Bill of Rights, or it wasn't just voter ID, but it was the concept of getting stuff back in front of the voters in a way where they were able to directly and definitively speak to what they wanted
Hmm.
in their Constitution. I just big fan of democracy, think it's important. And I felt like we were a part of educating the voters on what really was at stake and how to understand what those amendments were going to accomplish. And so I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you were probably able to. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I'm new to this movement, so I'm learning a lot. And I was in my doctor, just for a checkup, and of course the PA that was attending to me, she was like, "Well, what do you do?" And so I told her I work in the Liberty Movement and what that means and everything like that. And then it turned in that I thought it was going to be a 30-minute like quick checkup, and it turned in like an hour and a half where she was just ranting to me about how much she was frustrated with the state of healthcare and healthcare policy, and how can she get involved, and like she wants to. And I was like, oh well, we have so many think tanks that are working and trying to improve healthcare policy. And those conversations really, I knew to them, but it was really exciting to me to have that. And so now when I'm working on like marketing for SPN and we're talking about something related to healthcare, I'm thinking of her. Do you have moments too like that when there's impact in your professional life, and then you have a conversation later on with someone about that particular thing you were working on?
Oh, yes. And that's one of those things that just gets you really excited if you're in the policy space. Anyone who's watching this who has done this before knows, just like, you remember that's what it's about. That's who it's for. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm dealing with all those trolls online. But yeah, I've had that. Someone in the healthcare space who is subjected to some onerous occupational licensing strictures that make her job a lot more difficult than it should be. And so hearing what she's dealing with and telling her what we're working on to try to alleviate that specific issue has been very gratifying. I mean, we're still in the fight of it, but being able to do that is wonderful. And then another one still in the healthcare policy area, but this is something that I think more in our movement are starting to really get on their radar and address, is the mental health issues.
Oh.
And talking with legislators about ways in which they can make just access to care a little bit easier by removing some of these restrictions that they have on, like certificate of need is what it's called, where they limit the number of beds available in psychiatric facilities. And so sadly, there are times when we have to send children who are receiving mental health care out of the state because we don't have enough beds to treat them. And so thinking about the boys and girls, I had heard a story the other day of a 7-year-old boy who spent about 110 days in the ER here in North Carolina because there were no beds available for a child his age. And so can you imagine being a parent of a 7-year-old who is battling one of the greatest battle of their life, and they have to spend 100-something days, nearly a third of a year, in an emergency room? Just like, no one wants to be in an emergency room for more than a second, and to have to do that. And so that's another way, I think, like just hearing those stories and knowing what we're doing on the front of like removing certificate of need restrictions and expanding healthcare access. Those are really, really important things that just certainly keep me and my colleagues driven.
Beautiful. I'm so glad that's my favorite thing of being a part of this movement is getting to meet people like you that are working on stuff like that, like, and that are driven to do that. And because I didn't know that there was that many people out there doing this before now, and I'm starting to meet. But anyway, tell me a little bit more about, so we're talking to leaders in this podcast. So like we're interviewing people that are real leaders of this movement. So can you share a challenge or failure that you've had in your leadership journey and how you overcame it?
Yeah. One leadership principle I'll kick it off with, which kind of will speak to the challenge, is leaders create the weather around them. They're the ones that set the tempo, the environment, the climate. And so that's a responsibility that is both a joy, but it's also a weight. And it is something that means leaders shouldn't afford themselves the luxury of just letting stuff happen and letting life happen to them or their team. They need to create the culture. And I am one of those people that is not naturally a micromanager. And never do I want to be. I mean, we fight bureaucracy all the time. Why would I want to spend all of my time becoming a bureaucrat? But there is something to be said about having clarity, having definition in roles and responsibilities and expectations, and having direct conversations when we need to. That is a benefit to everyone. Everyone benefits from that clarity, and it then frees up your team and provides the security they need to know that they have clear expectations in mind, but you also have their back explicitly because you have given them this responsibility. And so I have been a casualty of not being explicitly clear at times, and had to navigate, what does that look like? Where did I fail as a leader and how can I serve my team better? Because that's really what leaders do. They are there to equip and empower their team members to be able to do their jobs well. It's not for them to make my life easier or to serve me. It's for me to empower them to do their job so that they can serve North Carolinians.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you for sharing. Well, I see that we're at time. Could we get a few minutes of grace to ask more questions? Do you have a few more minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so let's go ahead. I have so many, there's so many questions to have, but let's go off script a little bit. So tell me, I don't remember where I was listening to a podcast of yours yesterday, prepping for this podcast, and I saw that you or heard that you are a fan of C.S. Lewis, which I'm also huge fan of old Clive Staples.
Oh, God bless him. I love him.
Tell me, what are some, like, do you have, C.S. Lewis was just an inspiration of mine that I have, like, oh, that makes sense. What are inspirations that keep you going in this movement?
Oh, man. Okay. Well, you totally sidetracked me with talking about Jack. I love C.S. Lewis, and so he is my mental inspiration for just all the things, and love his book. So if you're a listener and you haven't really delved into C.S. Lewis literature, I recommend. Well, I like the Space Trilogy. I think that's really good.
I love Paralandra is, I think, my favorite. I don't know. I love Till You Have Faces too.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's my
is,
favorite.
Is it really?
Till We Have Faces, yeah. That's my favorite.
I think it's so relevant for here and now. Like, he's a true prophet. This guy, he saw so many things happen, and he's like, that's going to lead to this, and that's going to lead to that, and voila, here we are.
Yeah.
So yeah. Sorry, Paralandra is great. Keep on going.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree. So anyways, that's a shameless C.S. Lewis plug for all the other listeners. Lewis isn't paying us anymore for our endorsements of him because he's no longer with us. But yeah, so just other inspirations that I've looked to. This is going to sound a little self-serving, but I don't mean for it to. I mean this in sincerity. But my boss, Donald Bryson, our CEO at Locke, he and I met when he took over as CEO at Civitas Institute, and then I followed him and as well as other colleagues over during the merger from Civitas to Locke. But he just has such a good command of policy, but also very, very strategic thinker. And so I think that's something that a creative, which I tend to be more creative than super type A organized. But he's a very strategic thinker, and something he imparted to me early on was the importance of you have to have a why behind each of these things that you're doing, and there need to be actual measurable ways in which you evaluate whether or not you're successful. If not, it's not honoring donor dollars, even in the people who have invested in us. And so clearly articulating from the outset how important it is to have a way to evaluate our success, which we try to always tie to some legislative outcome in many ways or some other shift in public perception. That's been really, really helpful to me just as someone who is a little bit newer to the movement. Yeah. And then there have just been so many mentors and people that have spent time that they didn't have to spend investing in me and helping me understand comms practices better, better understand the policy side of things. One of them is one of your colleagues, Meredith Turney. She's invested a great deal just in my understanding of leadership and being a conscious leader and making sure that I show up well. And that's been a great benefit to me.
Meredith is awesome.
She is.
And it's not just because she's also from Texas or living in Texas. She's awesome just all the way around. Sorry, I'm from Texas, as you can tell. So tell me.
Yeah, you know what? A Texan will always out themselves because they can't help but being so proud of their state. Us North Carolinians are a little bit more humble and understated about it, but we still love our state just as much. But
we are the most precocious bunch ever. I apologize so much for how us Texans act, and I am absolutely guilty of it in every way, and embrace it. But I also apologize.
Big Texas, big love for Texas. I'm here for it. It's good.
Thank you. So you were speaking about your inspiration, and you spoke about Locke. So what are some of the hopes and goals for the future that you have there?
Yeah. there is a tactical goal that we have, and then there's the ideal that is sort of a North Star for us. Tactically, we want to continue to better understand our North Carolinian audience, like who is coming into our state, because we are receiving so many new folks that are moving from other states, other countries. So goal wise, like we really want to have our finger on the pulse. We want to have empathy for our fellow North Carolinian. And that means that we have to be proximate enough to them to actually do that, not sit in just an ivory tower think tank. We need to be on the ground. We're actually in the process of putting together a back to school event for underserved children to actually spend time with these boys and girls and their families and understand what they're struggling with, hear from them. I mean, what you guys are doing with this show is really important. It's helping humanize the network. We want to make sure that our policy folks and everyone who works here humanizes their fellow North Carolinian and spends time with that. So that's one of our goals that we're working on. And then just more broadly, it's to continue to be someone who fights fiercely for liberty on behalf of North Carolinians. Maybe it is, well, it's not just because I grew up as a military kid, but I mean, I lived on base for many, many years. I heard the evening revelry played, saw the flag go down. I remember we would go watch movies on the military base and we'd have to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance, or the Star Spangled Banner would play, and we'd have to do that before watching a movie on base. And just I'm patriotic, and liberty is worth preserving because people are worth it, and they're worth us making sure that we're protecting them well. And so that's a goal of Locke's, is to ensure that we are fierce advocates on their behalf.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. The preciousness of every human life.
Yeah.
It's something that, it's odd how that idea is almost a little, debated now. It seems like it should be taken for granted, but
Yeah.
it has to be defended. And I'm glad you're defending it. So I know, taking a lot of your time. I wanted to bring up though your chapter in the book that you wrote, where you're talking about the digital public square, and you contributed to a chapter where you're talking about hate speech in particular. And as I was reading this chapter, I was struck by, first of all, how difficult it is to talk about this. I would not have tried to speak about hate speech, because you have to balance this line, like between defending free speech and then also, well, you don't want to have people be so bullied online that they commit suicide or things like that. But what's the line? Obviously, people can disagree in goodwill quite a lot between that. And something that struck me was what we're trying to do here on Network Effects, where we're trying to build these micro networks where people are working together and trying to, in a very safe manner, cohesively work as a unit and be a community. And I was thinking that could be a potential future path, perhaps, for this sort of thing, where there's a lot of micro communities now that are in the digital space. Does it seem maybe too much pie in the sky? Like that's never going to, where it's going to just keep on getting bigger and bigger, like Facebook or Meta and everything is just going to steamroll everybody? Or what do you think of that?
No, I think that what Network Effects is working toward is like the digital version of what I envision Edmund Burke's Little Platoons being. It is just, we are made for community. There's this quote by this philosopher that has stuck with me for a long time now. It's Roger Scruton is his name. And he says, we're needy creatures, and our greatest need is for home, a place where we are loved and feel safe. It's not the direct quote, but it's along those lines. And although families look different nowadays and people don't live close to home anymore, I think there can be places, and there is a space and a conversation to be had about the importance of digital community and homes. And I even look at websites. That is a digital home. It is a piece of architecture that we have that lives in that space. And it is an extension of us. I mean, how we behave digitally is a reflection of who we are internally. And so I would love for us to move that Overton window in the right direction where people are humanizing one another. They do have those little platoons online. I think that would be healthy. As someone who didn't live in one place for very long ever growing up, my notion of home is a lot more expansive. It is not just related to where I am geographically. It's who I'm with. It's who's there. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for us to develop some healthy friendships and neighborly relationships online. And why not start with, people who love liberty? Let's set the example. People need a template to follow. So why don't we do it?
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Well, I have one last question, and I was wondering if you might nominate for us a neighbor from a neighboring think tank, someone else that we can speak to on our podcast.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I've got a long list of people. But I will just share one. And it was actually someone I had a conversation with at last SPN annual meeting. I met her there and she approached me. And she's an up and coming hard worker and star in the movement. I feel like her name is Anne-Marie Miller. She is starting at Ed Choice this next week. She was with Iron Light before that, as well as Illinois Policy Institute. But just a phenomenal young woman, very entrepreneurial. And so would love to hear more from her and have her share her story.
Wonderful. I'll reach out to her. We'll get the contact information afterwards. So Brooke, thank you so much.
Thank you, James. This was delightful.
I agree. All right. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to Neighbors in the Network, an offering from the State Policy Network. We hope that this podcast can serve as a place for empathy, understanding, and human connection. Please let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. And thanks again.